Hey everybody, this is Eric Worrell here again at the RentPrep office out in West Seneca, New York. And we are continuing this podcast from last week where we were talking about Landlord Vernacular. Want to keep these podcasts to about 15, 20 minutes. So we went a little bit long last week, so we're splitting this episode up. And we got 5 more terms for you right after we play some Happy Blues intro for you.
1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah.
Welcome to the Rent Prep for Landlords podcast. And now your hosts, Stephen White and Eric Worrell.
All right, the next term we have here is tenant improvements. So this just indicates whether the tenant has the right to make improvements to their property and to the extent to which the landlord will allow such improvements. We kind of talked about that earlier, but it's a good idea, again, to make sure that the tenant is aware of this. I think you mentioned just putting it in the lease and spelling it out for people.
It's a reason for a tenant to come up with why they're not going to pay the full month's rent. I painted this, or I had to do this, or whatever.
I replaced all the electrical.
Yeah, exactly, right. If you have it in your lease, that's a no-no, and I wouldn't have allowed that even if you did ask me. And if it becomes an after-the-fact conversation, you can always refer back to the lease and say, pull out the lease that you signed. Look, I specifically said no improvements to the property without pre-authorization. I knew nothing that you were going to replace all the electrical. This is not okay.
Yeah.
So, again, having a rock-solid lease in place is pretty important to protect yourself there.
All right. The next term we have on here is warranty of habitability.
Yeah, this is a big one. This is another one that I think is a catch-all. You know, I see pest issues kind of fall under this category, flooding issues, different type of issues that may affect the condition of the property and the habitability of the property. And a landlord has a responsibility to make sure that that property that they're renting is consistently habitable. And if it's not, they've got to make arrangements to put that tenant in a place that is.
Yeah. And I also thought it was interesting that, it's based on where you live too a little bit. So, because it's based on what's reasonable, and what's reasonable in one area may not be so in another, it's saying here. So it gave a good example that a Florida landlord's failure to properly insulate pipes may not violate the warranty of habitability. But here in Buffalo, New York, if you're not doing that and the pipes freeze and they don't have hot water, then yeah, maybe you are violating that. So it does kind of depend on where you live, and those factors can change of what is deemed reasonable.
Yeah. And again, just kind of tracking back, because I see this a lot with pests. That's where a landlord rents out a unit knowing that there's a pest issue there. This is not something where the tenant's been there for a year and consistently doesn't put their garbage in garbage cans, and they just throw it on the side of the house, and now they've got rat problems or cockroaches or whatever. This is a situation where the place wasn't habitable to start, to begin the lease. And, tenants end up moving in there, and now they've got an issue and they want to break the lease or get out of it. And this is sort of that catch-all that says, okay, there's a warranty of habitability. Landlord didn't meet. We're going to break this lease under that premise.
Okay. All right. Moving to the next term, Steve, I'm going to let you take this one because I feel like you're the expert on this one. The FCRA.
Yeah, FCRA, which is the acronym for Fair Credit Reporting Act. This is the set of guidelines that governs everything that we do here at a background check company, right? That we're running screening reports and performing background checks. That's the guideline that tells us misdemeanors are reportable for 7 years, and bankruptcies are for 10 years, and felonies are for lifetime if it's a conviction. And there's all these different statutes that kind of go along with the FCRA and allow us to report one thing and maybe not another. And we do get a lot of questions about this from landlords. And I think for the landlord, it's important to take away that if you're running a background check, the information that you're going to get back is going to be or should be compliant under the FCRA. So in other words, as a landlord, you cannot hold a felony arrest from 20 years ago that didn't result in a conviction. You can't hold that against the person and say, well, you were arrested for assault and battery, and that scares me from 1990. And even though you were found not guilty, I'm still going to hold this against you, and I'm not going to rent to you because that worries me. So the FCRA is the set of guidelines that says what's usable and what's not. Hopefully you've got a good agency that helps determine, what's being put on the the reports so that you're using good information and not bad information.
Yeah, and I kind of gather that this act was put there kind of as like a forgiveness over time kind of thing. So it's like somebody made a bad mistake, but it was 11 years ago. It's like, they're not going to be haunted by this thing forever. Of course, there's crimes that you can report forever, depending on the severity of the crimes. But yeah, it's just something that you should be aware of.
Yeah, in a nutshell, it's the reason that you can file bankruptcy and reestablish credit eventually later. It's the reason that you can make mistakes in your early 20s and go out and buy crazy things and, max out department store credit cards and then bounce back and, get yourself back on track. Without that
Hopefully
ability,
we don't have a lot of like 20-somethings listening to this and like, wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah, they all seem
Macy's.
They all seem to fall into a lot of the same traps.
Yeah,
and even I remember in college there was days where we had those guys come out with tables and little tents for getting a Discover card or this or that.
They always had really cool, especially when you're in college. You're like, oh my gosh, I'm going to get this like $100 prize, whatever they're given.
They prey on young people because they know, and of course the credit card companies are making money on you defaulting and paying late fees and those type of things. So you're their perfect customer.
Mm-hmm. And I do think it's worth mentioning that there's kind of a lesson inside of this too, because you were talking about like, if you don't want to tell a tenant that I denied you because of a bankruptcy from 12 years ago. So that's kind of a good piece of advice too. When you are denying a tenant applicant, you don't necessarily need to give them the specifics of it. I know we recommend using an adverse action letter if you deny somebody because of the background report, but not giving them the specific reason, just saying you were denied because of a background report.
Yep. The generic adverse action. You're denied because of your background report. If you want a copy of it, you can obtain a free one. But the minute you start saying exactly the reasons, you're opening up a conversation that you're probably not prepared to have and you probably don't want to have. You don't want to be telling somebody, yeah, there was a judgment here that really concerned me, because you're creating a conversation there now where they're going to give you 10 reasons why that judgment happened and why it shouldn't be used against them and why they're different than anyone else who might have a judgment, or it's just a road you don't want to go down for sure. You need to spend your time as a landlord finding quality applicants, and any chance that you get to move past somebody that you've already deemed as not qualified, you can't look back. You got to continue to look forward.
Okay. Well, looking forward, as your advice there. We're going to go to the next thing, and now we're talking about the FHA, which you've probably heard of, and that's the Fair Housing Act. And the definition of it is that it protects people from discrimination when they are renting, buying, or securing financing for any houses. Or any housing, I should say. I can't even get it right when I'm reading it. But the prohibitions specifically cover discrimination because of race, color, national origin, religion, sex, disability, and the presence of children, which is also known as familial status.
Yeah, so just for my 2 cents on this, the Fair Housing Act is dynamic in the sense that it changes fairly often. And landlords should be aware of these changes, and they usually coincide with the latest trends. Let me give you some really good examples. A couple of years ago on AMC or A&E, one of those television channels, there was a huge spike in popularity of these shows about hoarding, right? I forget the name of them.
Hoarders?
Hoarders, yeah. Hoarders, My Strange Addictions, whatever the name of the shows were.
Look, don't judge me if I want to chew the cushion inside of my couch, all right? It's tasty. You put a little salt on it.
Right. There's a narrow section of audience that got that and are like, oh, I saw that episode. It was crazy.
Everyone else is like, that guy's weird.
Yeah. But this changes. A couple years ago, hoarding was considered a mental disorder. Now that falls under the category of a disability, and you cannot discriminate against somebody because they're a hoarder. That had a huge impact on landlords. Created a whole new addendum that they needed to use, a good housekeeping addendum that, you had to have all these things in place, because if somebody ended up becoming a hoarder, they could eventually say, well, that's a disability that I'm struggling with and I can't be removed from my property because of that. Same thing with transgender. That seems to be the latest trend in topics right now. It's just a hot topic in society. And of course, that has been added to the Fair Housing Act. So it definitely, like I said, it's dynamic. It's kind of changing. It's always being adapted, and they're adding new things and trying to be aware of what's happening in our culture, in our society, and it's usually reflected in the Fair Housing Act.
And I think it's also worth mentioning, too, that it's not the catch-all of discrimination. There's still rules you have to look for and research with your local city, town, and counties. Because I know when we went to that landlord training, there were certain rules in a couple towns in our area that didn't apply necessarily to the FHA, but they were specific to that town. So that's why we're always saying, make sure you're researching your local laws as well, because there might be a couple other things that you weren't aware of that you need to be in the know.
Yeah, local laws will take precedence. So you need to know what your municipality says about certain things, because it may not jive with what federal law states. And so it's really important to just get in touch with your local community and find these things out. And the best place to do that, a big shout out to landlord associations, real estate investor associations. These are people who know your local market really well. And a great example is locally here in Buffalo. On an application, you're not allowed to put or ask for the date of birth. And it was something that came to light when one member of the association got in trouble for it. And so now he's bringing that knowledge to the entire group for the benefit of everybody. So it's really important to kind of stay in touch with your community to know what your local municipality laws are saying that may conflict with what you think is right.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
And then what we're going to get to last here, because I feel like people have been on the edge of their seats for this entire episode, because they're like, what's a lodger? Steve, let them know.
A lodger is a person who lives in a room in a house where the owner lives. And the owner can enter all areas occupied by the lodger and has overall control of the house. So in the case where we spoke to this, I guess you call him a landlord, he was a homeowner who either had done his research or knew about this or had this type of a thing going long enough that he knew what a lodger was and made us look it up. But he was basically renting a room. And the issue that he was having was the lodger was basically suspected of doing some things in the room that they shouldn't have. I think they had a grow room in there, or they were growing marijuana plants in there, which is pretty bold if you're just renting a room and you're living with the owner of the property.
Sure.
And you feel like you can get away with that. But
yeah, the same skunk just keeps going by, like on the outside of the house. It's not my room.
Right. Yeah. So, in that case, it's different from other things. It's not a sublet. It's not a typical tenancy. It's more of a roommate type of situation where you the owner occupier has a little bit more control over the situation than a typical landlord that has to jump through the hoops of right of entry and those type of things, where if you're dealing with somebody who's identified as a lodger, you can occupy all areas of that property still because you're living in there still.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I think that about does it for this. Hopefully, you learned something listening to this. I know I learned a little bit just researching some of these terms here. And I'll finish this episode by saying if you want to get more involved and more in touch with us and also other landlords, we do have that private Facebook group that I had mentioned before. If you're on Facebook, just look in the search bar, just put in RentPrep for landlords, the same exact name as this podcast, and just request to join access to the group, and we'll get you in there. And it just made me think of it because I know I've seen a few of these questions discussed on there. And it's just nice to be able to tap into the minds of a bunch of fellow landlords and see what other people think, because it can be a little lonely being a landlord.
Sure. And that group is like a new age way of being part of a local association in some ways. We've got pockets in that group of people who identify, I'm in that same area. And then they're communicating more so together or maybe messaging each other because they're in that specific area. So we start to see, even within that group, it sort of niche itself down. And now they're dealing locally. We've got a lot of local guys in there just from our own area too. So it's pretty neat to see.
And now I should say that it's not a prerequisite for getting into the Facebook group, but if you did want to leave us a review on iTunes or however you listen to our podcast, we do read those, and it'd be nice to make that connection that we're getting people to the Facebook group from listening on the podcast. So if you're listening, leave us a review. Tell us what you think about the podcast. Check us out on Facebook. Search for RentPrep for Landlords. I'll personally accept you into the group, and the more the merrier, the better the conversation that we can have. So from all of us here at RentPrep, have a good week, and we'll be in touch soon.